Some people are better built for squatting than others. But why is this? What is it about one person's body that may make them better equipped for squatting than someone else? And more importantly, if you're not as well built for squatting, does that mean you shouldn't do it? Absolutely not, because squatting is such an amazing exercise that can greatly improve strength, sports performance, and help us to maintain functionality as we age. So you could definitely make the argument that nearly everyone should do some form of squatting because there are so many variations and modifications that we can apply to make you a great squatter, regardless of your body type. So today, because it's obviously very fascinating, we'll answer why certain body types may be a little bit more advantageous for squatting than others, and again, show you some modifications that you can apply to your squat to make it work best for you. So let's do this. So why are some people a little bit better built for squatting than others? Well, we're going to approach this with a discussion about center of gravity, because all of us have to maintain our center of gravity while we squat, or we're going to fall over. And so to help us understand what I mean by all this, we're going to use these stick figure drawings on the whiteboard, and these are representing the bottom position of, say, like a parallel squat. And this line here is representing the foot, and then you can see the ankle joint here. And in the bottom position of a squat, the ankle is in dorsal flexion. Now, as an FYI, our last squat video, we went into more detail about joint positions and all the muscles involved in a squat, but I'll review some of the key points here. If you haven't heard of dorsal flexion, it's when the top of the foot comes closer to the shin bone, which this is the shin bone here represented, and that's the tibia. And then we have the knee joint, that's in flexion at the bottom of a squat, and the horizontal line is representing the femur or thigh bone. Then we have the hip here. The hip's position is in flexion, as you can see by me squatting down here. And then we have the torso represented by this line. The red line down here is representing a really important muscle that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And the red circle is representing like a weight or a barbell that we might be squatting. And the dotted line is showing you our center of gravity, or how that weight is going to be transmitted throughout the body. And this is really important to how you might squat differently than, say, another person. So let's use me as an example here. If I take this barbell and I perform a barbell squat, notice what happens to my hips as I go deeper into the squat position. As I get lower and lower and lower, you can see that I have to hinge more at my hips, and my torso is much less upright. And again, this is all about how I have to move my body to maintain my center of gravity. Now, if I change the weight position and move it to the front of my body, I can kind of tweak the center of gravity in a way. And you might notice with the front squat, I might be able to maintain a little bit more of an upright posture. Now, I can give you a little bit more of an extreme example. If I were to come over to the table here and hold on to the table, you can see I can pretty much go into a completely deep squat and maintain almost a completely upright posture. But you know, if I let go of the table, I'm gonna fall over because I couldn't maintain my center of gravity in that position. Now, this whole center of gravity thing is greatly influenced by the length of your bones, like the ratio of the length of the femur to the tibia. But we'll mostly focus on the length of the femur. So if we look at the length of the femur on this particular body, this is how much hinging has to occur at the hip, and therefore the torso coming forward, in order to maintain one center of gravity. But if we come over to this example, this body has a shorter femur. Look how much less hinging at the hip is required, and it allows the body to be in a more upright position, specifically that torso, as opposed to someone with a longer femur. I've seen people in the gym with beautiful looking squats, where they're squatting all this weight and their torso is almost completely upright. And admittedly, I'm slightly jealous. But this whole idea of having a longer versus a shorter femur, what does this mean from a muscular perspective if you were to have a longer femur? Well, let's first look at the upper portion of the torso. If you have to hinge further at the hips, that's going to require more work on the extensor muscles of the spine in order to maintain the proper spinal position. Also, if we hinge further at the hips, that's going to require more range of motion for the actual hip muscles that are active during the squat. We're going to be putting a greater eccentric load or greater length requirement on those muscles that mobilize the hip. And just as a reminder, an eccentric load or an eccentric contraction is when the muscle is actively lengthening. And the muscles that are actively lengthening or eccentrically contracting at the hip during a squat to control us on that lowering phase are the hamstrings, the glutes, and a muscle called the adductor magnus. And just to kind of give you a visual of what's going on there, so I'll use this rubber band to try to show the active lengthening of the muscle. So this is like the orientation of one of the hamstring muscles, and as you can see, I go down, that rubber band is lengthening, kind of showing you how that hamstring would eccentrically be contracting or lengthening as I go down. The gluteus maximus would be in this position. You can see how that would lengthen. And then this muscle that not as many people know about, called the adductor magnus, this one's going to be really important for our discussion a little bit later. This one also will be actively lengthening during that lowering phase of the squat. And with all this talk about squatting, it might be getting some of you excited about the potential to build leg muscles. But sometimes people can actually have trouble putting on lean muscle mass. And so some men may be curious about their testosterone levels. And that's why I want to take a second to say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Maximus. Maximus has a testosterone protocol, or what they also refer to as their EP protocol, where E stands for enclomiphene and P stands for pregnenolone. Enclomiphene blocks selective estrogen receptors, which is important because you don't want to block every estrogen receptor, as estrogen does have other important functions. But this selective blocking stimulates your body's own natural testosterone production within the testes. And pregnenolone is a cornerstone molecule that serves a key role in the production of other hormones, such as testosterone. Studies have demonstrated that most individuals experience an average of a 1.5 to 2.5 times increase in their total and free testosterone levels with this protocol, without the testicular shutdown, shrinkage, infertility, or the need for an injection. And I want to be clear here, I am not advocating that everyone needs to boost their testosterone levels, and I certainly don't think something like this should be done without the help of an experienced clinician. But this is another reason why I like Maximus, because Maximus connects you with licensed doctors who are experts in men's hormonal health. And once you get connected with one of these doctors, you'll complete an at-home lab analysis prior to beginning a protocol to determine the best dose for you. After the first month, you complete an additional at-home lab to determine how the protocol is working and if dosages need to be adjusted. Maximus also uses trusted US-based compounding pharmacies to ensure all products are safely sourced and authentic, and is also FDA compliant. So if you're interested in trying this protocol from Maximus, we'll have that link and the information in the description below. And now, let's get back to squatting. But again, to drive this point home, the more we have to hinge at the hip, the more active lengthening or eccentric demand is placed on those muscles, and the more we have to work to stabilize the spine. Now, I'm not saying that someone with a shorter femur doesn't work hard when they squat. I am saying that they have a biomechanical advantage, and generally they can squat deeper before they start to get to the length limitations in those muscles of the hip. When you get to those limitations in the muscle's ability to lengthen any further, you'll start to find it more difficult to maintain that proper postural alignment of the spine that you definitely want to keep during a squat. Sometimes when people get down to close to parallel or even deeper into a squat, they'll notice that the pelvis will almost start to tilt underneath, or what we call a posterior pelvic tilt, and it kind of just rolls underneath the body slightly. They also call this the butt wink. I'm not sure that's the best name in the world, but that's what they call it. So let's use me as an example here again. As I put this barbell on my back, as I get close to parallel, you might notice this subtle tucking under of my pelvis, and you should be able to see it now. And this is because the pelvis is attached to the sacrum, the lower part of the spine, and this will flatten out my lower back or my lumbar spine. And if I were to really load up the weight on that barbell, when my pelvis tucked under right there and my back flattened out a little bit, this could potentially put me in a compromised situation. So how could someone fix this? Should you just not do parallel or deep squats anymore and stop the range of motion just before you get to the infamous butt wink? I mean, you could just do quarter and half squats for the rest of your life, but you're leaving a lot of potential benefits on the table if you don't deep squat. Now, I will say that quarter squats can have their place in certain training protocols. For example, somebody who's really training for like a vertical jump, they may want to spend some time training the top end of the squat, that popping of the hips that occurs during a jump. That person might really load up a barbell with more weight than they could lift during a full squat, just to train that specific range on the end of the vertical jump. But even still, that person would likely also include full squats as part of their routine. Full range of motion squats have been shown to be more effective for stimulating strength and hypertrophy gains. Full range of motion would also obviously help you to maintain mobility. And from an aging and longevity standpoint, who doesn't want to just be able to squat all the way down when they're 70 or 80 and just pop right back up again? So here are some things that you can do to help you get into a deep squat while maintaining proper alignment. If you're too narrow in your stance, you can get to this place where you start to have tissue approximation, where literally your soft tissues and even some of your bones contact each other and they stop you from going any further. And you might, if you tried to go any further in that, you might end up like rounding your back or getting in some compromised position. But if you were to just slightly widen your stance, and you could even externally rotate your hips a little bit, you don't need to go that far, just a little bit of a subtle external rotation, that'll kind of get that tissue approximation issue taken care of and will allow you to go deeper down into a squat. But eventually you still might find that you get to that point where you've reached the maximum length of a hip muscle, and then your pelvis might tilt, causing you to lose that alignment in your spine. So what muscles might be the limiting factors that are causing this tilting of the pelvis, or again, that butt wink? Many people will blame the hamstrings for this limitation, but it's not usually the hamstrings. And this is because your hamstrings also cross and flex the knee. So as you go down into a squat, now if I use my rubber band as the hamstrings here, yes, I will get some lengthening of the hamstring fibers that are associated with the hip, but I'm also bending or flexing the knee, which will actually give length back to the hamstrings. Just as if you were doing like a hamstring stretch, if you were to bend down and touch your toes, as soon as you were to like bend your knees, you would notice that you no longer really feel that hamstring stretch anymore. The gluteus maximus generally isn't the limiting factor either, but the adductor magnus muscle that I mentioned earlier often is the limiting factor. The adductor magnus has a head or a portion of the muscle that acts like a hamstring at the hip, but not at the knee, because it doesn't cross the knee. And that's what I've drawn here on the stick figure here. This red line's representing the adductor magnus ending before the knee. So as one bends down into a squat position, that adductor magnus, I'll try to show you the orientation here, will lengthen and lengthen and lengthen and stretch. And because of where it's attached to the pelvis is going to eventually turn underneath if you get to a point where the adductor magnus can't lengthen anymore. So kind of think of it as, I get to a point where I'm lengthening the adductor magnus, and it's like, I can't lengthen anymore. And if you push the squat even further, something's got to give in the system, and that's going to tug and pull the pelvis underneath, which can potentially flatten out the back, and you would lose that spinal posture alignment that you want. So how could you fix this? Well, you would want to increase the length and the strength of your adductor magnus. And one very effective way to do this is with an exercise like the seated good morning. A seated good morning can strengthen the adductor magnus, but you would also want to try to go further and further in that range of motion as part of your progression. And the more mobility you get in this muscle, that could potentially translate to increased range of motion in the squat without that butt wink and the flattening out of the back. Another thing that you could do immediately to get into a deeper squat, presumably while you're still working on your adductor magnus and hip mobility, is to elevate your heels. For example, if I move back and get onto this slant board right here and just elevate my heels, you'll notice that the elevation of my heels allows me to maintain a more upright torso without compromising my spine and going into a deeper squat. Now, why is that? Well, I said a little bit earlier, I talked a little bit earlier about this ratio of the femur to the tibia, and we mostly talked about the femur here. But we haven't talked a ton about the ankle joint. And if somebody had a little bit more range of motion at their ankle joint and they could get a little bit more dorsal flexion, hinging a little bit more at their ankle, this is a connected system. And so if you get changes in movements here, it's going to affect things upstream. So a little bit more dorsal flexion at the ankle could allow me to have a little bit less flexion of the hip and be a little bit more upright in my posture or with my torso. And so this could be helpful for also getting into deeper squatting. But no matter what, if you have a longer femur in proportion to your tibia, that extra range of motion is going to have to come from somewhere, either at the hip muscles or the ankle muscles, or a combination of the two. So to review all the key takeaways here, If you're trying to increase the range of motion of the squat while maintaining proper spinal alignment, the immediate changes you could make is slightly widen your stance, and you could also elevate your heels. For more of the long-term modifications, working to improve hip mobility at the adductor magnus, as well as your ankle mobility with your calf muscles. But hopefully that gives you some really cool info on what the different requirements are for squatting with different bone lengths. And I do want to say that I've seen people with long femurs still squat a ton of weight. So don't let that discourage you. There are people who are fairly tall and have long femurs who work really hard and have amazing squats. People with short femurs can clearly have some amazing squats too. So keep up the squatting, everyone. And if you want to check out some of our previous squatting videos, we'll link that here. We'll also link a video on strength versus hypertrophy. Thanks for supporting the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.